When the war on Ukraine is turning more and more frustrating for Russia, both Beijing and Taipei are watching closely. If you were a senior Chinese general, at this point, would you suggest Xi Jinping take Taiwan by force or not because of how the war has turned out in Ukraine?
If I was a PLA general, I would be telling, General Secretary Xi, here's what we know about what has occurred in the Ukraine. Here's where the Russians made mistakes. Here's how we have overcome those mistakes.
But are the Taiwanese as alert as they should be?
From what I've read is that the crash of an ROC Air Force training aircraft that killed, unfortunately, a Taiwan Air Force pilot, that seemed to have garnered more attention and criticism from the press in Taiwan than the fact that the PRC had sent 30 aircraft into their air defense identification zone.
The Russian army's performance has been less impressive than many military experts had expected. Is China's military on the same caliber? Seeing how the Ukraine war has been unfolding, is China less likely to take Taiwan by force? I had this discussion with James Fanell, former Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. I'm Simone Gao, and you are watching Zooming In. How would you compare Russia's military power to that of China after seeing what happened in Ukraine?
Well, this is, again, an assessment based on my own observations of the Chinese military over the years. And that obviously has to be couched in terms of we don't know because we haven't seen them in action like we're seeing the Russians right now. But from what I see with the amount of training that the Chinese have, the amount of arms and capabilities that they have, their focus on joint integration, it seems to me that they have a capability that I think is greater than the Russians in terms of mass. Russia has a lot of forces. Russia amassed, over 100,000 ground troops on the Ukrainian border. But I think that when China decides to take Taiwan, they're going to be able to amass 1 million or 2 million to be able to come across the Taiwan Strait. And I think that's something that people don't really comprehend. Especially when you're talking about the concept of people's war, where the totality of the Chinese society would be brought to bear against Taiwan. But there's another difference, obviously, the terrain. It's a land war in Russia and Ukraine. Going across the Taiwan Strait's a different endeavor. That's why the Chinese Navy is much greater than the Russian Navy in terms of this kind of operation. And then you add in the Strategic Rocket Force of the PLA, the Strategic Support Force. I think there's a lot there that the Chinese have capability-wise. And I think what they've done is they basically used this 3 months of conflict as a schoolhouse. The Chinese military leaders, PLA leaders, Central Military Commission, are probably intimately studying what the Russians are doing. They obviously have connections with the Russians. We saw the Russians and the Chinese flying together, their bombers in formation with fighter escorts in the Sea of Japan this last week. That doesn't happen if you don't have close military contact. And so if the Russians and the Chinese are operating together in the Sea of Japan, you can very well be sure that China's also requesting and getting intelligence and feedback from the Russians on what's working and what's not working. How are the Western allies supporting the Ukraine, and what is Ukraine doing? So I'm sure that China is studying all these details and getting smarter and updating their war plans and their contingency plans that they have for Taiwan.
After seeing what happened in Ukraine, some analysts say it almost looks like Russia is not fighting a war of the 21st century, but a war in the 19th or 20th century. Their military branches are not integrated well. They don't use intelligence well. They fire heavy artillery and move their troops in big blocks. What's your opinion on this? Is China the same way?
Right, that's a good question. There's basically this idea of attrition warfare, slow, tank battles and ground forces supported by heavy fires of artillery, mass bombardments on artillery at certain locations and just kind of slugging it out like they did in World War II in Stalingrad or something. And so I think that's a fair assessment that from what we've seen so far. I don't think that's too much off the mark. So then the next question that you raised, and I've seen the discussions, is whether or not the Chinese military is wedded to the same kind of doctrine in the way they fight. And I think up until the last 20 years, and maybe 10 years, Chinese military doctrine, especially for the PLA army, is very much probably influenced by old Soviet military doctrine that we're seeing played out in the Ukraine. But I do think because the Soviet Navy is now the Russian Navy, and their doctrines didn't really, I don't think, influence the Chinese Navy in their development and the Chinese Air Force and the Chinese Strategic Rocket Force in the same fashion. And so I think what we have with the PLA today is a much more modern force, not just in the weapons that they have, but in the way that they look at fighting a war. I mean, I gave a speech 8 years ago where we were quoting Chinese generals talking about conducting a short, sharp war. So they're aware of this. We know that the Chinese leaders, military leaders, have gone to school on Desert Storm from 1990, 1991, and the shock and awe campaign that the U.S. military inflicted on Saddam Hussein and his military. So we know that the Chinese have studied these things, have tried to mimic the development of their own military to be able to do these kinds of short, sharp war, lightning strikes. I think the Chinese have a different doctrinal perspective when it comes to this. Now, we know in 1950, when they fought in the Korean War, they fought much like the Russians are fighting today in the Ukraine. But again, that was 72 years ago or so. And I think the Chinese in the last 20 years have really adapted and altered their doctrine and have gotten much more in tune with the United States' military way of fighting in this 21st century. And so I would expect that the Chinese would operate that way.
You are the one who have been, raising the alarm of how the PLA military power is advancing fast and in some areas even surpassed the US. How is the situation right now? Do you think America has the ability to protect Taiwan?
I'm very, very concerned about our ability, the United States' ability to protect Taiwan, defend Taiwan from an invasion from China. As you noted, I have been warning about this, and what I see today, and I'm seeing more and more like-minded security officials, people that hadn't said anything in the past few years, are now starting to sound the alarm that we're really in a serious situation, especially when our budgets that are being submitted are clearly not the kind of budgets that we would expect to see in the face of such a growing threat from the PRC and the PLA. So I worry that the relatively static size of the U.S. 7th Fleet and the 5th Air Force and other 7th Air Force, our Marine 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force in Okinawa, those permanently deployed or forward deployed permanent forces that we have out in the Western Pacific, that size and the capabilities are generally the same over the last 30 years. Now, there's been improvements in the different types of equipment that they have, and there's been 2,500 Marines that are rotationed out of Darwin in Australia. But other than that, there hasn't been a dramatic increase in the presence and size of the U.S. Western Pacific military forces, while China has dramatically changed and grown and altered the military balance of power in the region. China's Navy is now the largest Navy in the world. Ours is around 297 ships, but we have to split those ships essentially between our east and west coast, so they're not all focused and on station in the Western Pacific. So China's advantage, even though they're the largest Navy, is even greater than just saying they're the largest navy by a few ships. They're now actually much larger because they're concentrated there in China inside the first and second island chain, while ours are on our west and east coast and have thousands and thousands of miles to sail before they could actually get into the combat area to help defend Taiwan. So I'm really worried that we're not prepared. I think the people that are in the military, the people that are at sea today, are good Americans, and they want to do the right thing. They're planning and practicing to do the right things to defend Taiwan, but they don't have the resources. There's been cuts to training and maintenance funds over the years that make them less able to be as sharp as they should be. Maybe as when I was in active duty, we're seeing more and more pictures of U.S. Navy warships that are rusted out and not prepared, not materially ready as they could be or should be. And so I worry about all these things. And I'm very concerned that our Congress doesn't seem to be alarmed. They should be it's like if a house is on fire, they call the fire department, and there's a four alarm fire. It's the highest number of alarms you can have to get the whole fire department out to put out the big fire. And we should be at a 4-alarm fire status right now inside the United States Department of Defense and our Congress as it comes to realizing that China is on the brink of doing something like we're seeing being done in the Ukraine.
So that was what I was going to ask you. After seeing what was happening in Ukraine, do you think Washington will be more candid or less candid in boosting the U.S. military? I mean, do they see Russia not as competent as they thought, and so would be China? Or do they see China would do something similar, so the threat to Taiwan is real and the U.S. needs to get prepared?
There's a mixed message coming out of this White House, and it's confused people from the left, from the right side of the aisle. And then we have to look at things like arms sales. And there's a great concern that arms sales from the United States to Taiwan, there's been either a cancellation or delay of a number of weapons here in the last few months. And that's alarming, given the one thing that we know from the experience in the Ukraine is that if we had armed up the Ukraine before the Russian invasion, it may have altered Putin's desire to risk a war in the Ukraine. And I know many, many people in Washington, D.C., the experts, the so-called experts, say, if you do that, you will be provoking China to attack. And my answer to them is, that's what you assess. However, what we know is that Chinese intend to attack Taiwan. And if we're not going to do anything to deter them, so what's the difference? If they're going to come after I send arms into Taiwan, well, at least we have a fighting chance. If I don't do anything, then those people in Taiwan have no chance. And so I think we've got many, many years of the Kissinger school of engagement that says we should engage with China and things will get better and they'll come along to understand how beneficial the existing international system is. We got 50 years of engaging with them, and that didn't work. We also, at that same time, we were also saying we must never provoke China. If we do it, almost anything that the U.S. did could be characterized as provoking China as it relates to U.S.-China policy. If somebody from the U.S. government, the president, the vice president, the secretary of state or defense, were to fly to China for a meeting with their counterparts, we would have people from the State Department saying, oh, then we should not fly intelligence collection flights inside the first island chain because we might provoke China while our senior diplomats are there. And that would be detrimental to negotiations and engagement. And then it got so crazy during the Obama years that kind of mindset didn't just apply to the very top of the U.S. government. It went all the way down to assistant secretaries of defense and assistant secretaries of state at lowest levels. So we have tied our own hands for 20 or more than 20 years when dealing with China. And we have not prepared Taiwan to the extent that they really need to be armed to present a credible deterrent force to Taiwan. And so I would suggest that we start providing them those materials, those weapons as soon as possible, and that we would also establish a combined command structure in Taiwan that we composed of Taiwan military, U.S. military, Japanese military, and other members of the Quad or whoever else wants to join that to conduct training and not just training, but to have a command and control structure that would allow us to be effective when the invasion were to occur, if it were to occur. We have such structure on the Korean Peninsula today. It's called Combined Forces Command. It combines U.S. and Korean military together, and they sit shoulder to shoulder with each other in command centers and in the field and in the fleet. And we should be doing something very much similar towards Taiwan right now.
This question has always perplexed our non-military people. Does the DoD have an existing operational plan regarding the Taiwan Strait under various circumstances? If so, does the ambiguity coming out of the White House matter? What role does the President and Congress play in a potential conflict over the Taiwan Strait?
Well, it's always natural to assume that militaries plan. I mean, and plan for contingencies. We have a whole, if you could look at our joint doctrine, we have operational plans, O plans, and we have contingency plans, con plans. That's part of our doctrine. You can read about it. It's in the open press. I can't talk about specific plans that the Indo-PACOM has. I can just say that I was almost 30 years in the Indo-Pacific Command, or then called PACOM, Pacific Command. And I can say that, at every level that I was at, we had what we called the military nomenclature. We have the planning shop, the J5 at the joint level, the N5 at the Navy level. And so there's planners, there's people on the staffs of these military commands inside the U.S. military that are planners. And our counterparts in other militaries are planners as well. And so if you're assigned to the Indo-Pacific, it's probably a good chance that you're planning for something that has to do with an invasion of Taiwan. That's not a secret. But your question is, well, because we have a plan, therefore we don't have to worry so much about what Biden or the Congress say. And I disagree with that. I think, as I said before, the entirety of leading a nation into combat in terms of making decisions about what a nation will do, that has to be led by the President of the United States. We've seen it play out in Afghanistan in terms of how the evacuation of Kabul and the decision making about why to leave Bagram Air Base. These were all decision parameters, that were set by the President of the United States. We've seen it here in the Ukraine. The President of the United States has had the most influential say, even to the partners in NATO, about whether or not we would allow combat aircraft and other kinds of weapons to be given to the Ukraine. And it will be exactly the same thing in a Taiwan scenario. The President of the United States will have this influence over how a fight would be engaged, whether or not we would be full in or we would try to hedge. And the Congress has a role, both constitutionally and through, its ability to, in terms of authorizations of war and that nature, but also through what they authorize in terms of funding for the buildup of military forces and readiness. And so both institutions have a responsibility they have a huge responsibility in this. And it's not just left up to the commander of Indo-PACOM and his planning staff and his fielded forces to just go about and do the business of defending Taiwan. It will take much more than that.
If you would like to watch the rest of it, please go to our website, zoomingin.tv, and become a member. $5 a month or $50 a year. Cancel anytime. You will have access to my extended interviews and full in-depth reports. For those who are not quite ready to become a member yet, you are welcome to visit our website as well. We have all the shows you can watch on YouTube, plus transcripts on our website. YouTube only allows for a short description, but on our website, we post the full transcripts. You can simply donate to us on that website as well. Finally, I would also like to thank our sponsor, Shenyun Performing Arts. Enjoy Shenyun at your nearest theater. And for Zooming In members, you can get discounted tickets at shenyun.org/Simone-Gao. Have a great day, and I'll see you very soon.
You are not just watching a performance. You are witnessing a culture reborn. Now, you'll see what the modern world has never seen. China, before communism. Shenyun 2022. Live on stage. Get tickets now at shenyun.com.